Welcome back to another episode of the Aquademia podcast. I'm your host, Justin Grant.
And I'm Maddie Cassidy.
And today we are sitting down with the Association of Genuine Alaska Pollock Producers CEO, Craig Morris, to talk about all things Pollock.
If you're a regular listener of the podcast, then you know that one of our favorite series to come back to is our Species Spotlight episodes. And we're coming back with another one today.
This conversation was amazing. Craig is a wealth of knowledge, and we got through so much information. I think for anyone that knows anything about the species Pollock, you should still tune in. And if you don't, definitely listen to the whole thing because we go through a wide range of topics.
There's a lot in there.
But before we get into those topics, make sure to follow Aquademia on X at Aquademia Pod. If you want to reach out to the podcast for any reason, you can fill out our online form, which is located at globalseafood.org/podcast.
And the best way to support the show is by leaving a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you listen to us on.
And we will see you at the end.
Welcome to the Aquademia podcast.
Our diet is hurting the environment in myriad ways. I mean, we desperately need to eat more seafood.
This is a pioneering industry with a whole lot of people who have really good ideas and a lot of experience and are unafraid.
Aquademia is your go-to podcast for a fresh take on all things seafood.
Craig, thank you so much for joining Maddie and I at the Aquademia podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and it's amazing to be here.
Yeah, well, we're glad we were able to get you on actually in relatively short notice, and you have been a very busy person. You've traveled a lot of places in a short amount of time, so we're glad that we were able to get you on and touch on the species Pollock. But before we get into that, could we have you introduce to our audience who you are and what you do?
Well, my name is Craig Morris. I'm the CEO of the Association of Genuine Alaska Pollock Producers. Our sole mission is to build awareness and demand for wild Alaska pollock globally.
Fantastic. So since this is part of our Species Spotlight series that we do on the podcast, the first thing that we usually like to start off with is giving some sort of introduction, context around what this species is, why people should care about it. So can you start by giving us a brief overview of pollock as a species and what sets it apart from other fish species?
Well, wild Alaska pollock, and we do like to call it wild Alaska pollock, is an amazing fish. To be called Alaska pollock in the United States anyway, it's always caught in the icy cold waters of Alaska, meaning it's domestically caught. It's always wild caught, which we know that many consumers prefer. It's mild tasting, which makes it very approachable and works in a variety of cuisines. And it's, of course, it has the nutrition halo that all seafood enjoys. And finally, it has an unmatched sustainability story. Basically, there's only one fish in the world of our scale that checks all 5 of those boxes.
That actually is a good segue to the next one, which was sustainability practices. So could you walk us through how pollock is harvested? I know you mentioned where, but could you talk a little bit more about those practices?
The Alaska pollock fishery was really built from the lessons learned from other fisheries around the world. It operates under what is really globally viewed as the gold standard in fishery management. It's a partnership between industry and government that has stood the test of time.
Right.
It's kind of funny, but I was recently asked to look up our fisheries catch from 40 years ago, 1983, and it was almost identical to what we caught last year. And frankly, that's no accident. Mm-hmm. Each year, our industry and our partners at NOAA, we do an assessment of the biomass, and we catch each year less than 15% of those fish that are in the Bering Sea. That means we leave over 85% of the Alaska pollock in the Bering Sea to preserve for future generations. It's also what we call a rationalized fishery. And by that, I mean there's a defined set of companies that own a share of that annual catch.
Okay. That
rationalization provides firms the opportunity to really take the time they need to harvest the fish as responsibly as possible and not racing with each other, trying to find every last fish they can. There's also some parts of the fishery that I think everyone should be proud of. In perpetuity, 10% of the catch of Alaska pollock is owned by the 65 indigenous communities in Alaska that border the resource. And those communities have chosen to use those funds to invest back into our fishery. Today, fully a third of the Alaska pollock fishery is owned by Alaskans, bringing real resources back to communities, frankly, that need it the most. And that's something I think we all really should be proud of.
Is there a challenge fishing for pollock in the Bering Sea? I mean, I think some of our listeners that aren't in the industry and might be just general consumers, when they envision the Bering Sea, it's a rough and challenging environment. And could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Here in Seattle, a lot of people are talking about having to go back into the office and all of the stresses that has on modern families and those of us, obviously, that have worked through the COVID period. But there is nothing that is more extreme than the way Alaska pollock is harvested in the environment that it's harvested in. Deadliest Catch, the TV show
right.
that talks about the crab fishery in the Bering Sea, it is sensationalized. But those are real waves that you're seeing, and those are real boats that are really coming up and down. I got some videos, actually. Our A season just started last week, and I got some videos from some of the boats last week. And these are extreme conditions that these people go through to bring this just amazing protein to the plates of consumers around the world. So it's a real environment up there, and that's one of the reasons it's a relatively young fishery. It's just been in modern times that man could go out into that vast Bering Sea and harvest these fish and bring it to consumers.
Yeah, it's really tremendous, and it brings some really strong visuals picturing what that must be like. And I think Deadliest Catch probably helps a little bit with that. So in your work at the Association of Genuine Alaska Pollock Producers, GAPP, a huge part of your work is helping spread the word and awareness about this specific protein. So I think it would be really beneficial if you help walk through a little bit behind the scenes of that with our listeners today. So how has the demand for pollock evolved over the years? And I'm sure that GAPP has played a huge role in that. And are there any emerging trends or markets that have had a significant impact recently?
That's a great question. I think in my chapter with the fishery, the biggest change that we've seen is the name Alaska pollock moving to the front of pack and on menus. In many respects, Alaska pollock is actually, as I said before, a really young fishery, and it was born from a need really to fill the hole that was caused by the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery, and a need for another, really mild-tasting whitefish for everything from QSR fish sandwiches to fish sticks in the frozen food aisle. The thing was, when Alaska pollock filled that hole, most consumers didn't know what Alaska pollock was. This is really where GAPP has stepped up in creating awareness and demand for what an amazing fish Alaska pollock is, and to incentivize brands through the GAPP Partnership Program to be proud to have the name Alaska pollock called out on their menus or on their packages of food at retail. And then there's this whole serene seafood side of our fishery as well. I mean, if we're talking trends, is there anything hotter right now than the imitation crab boil mukbang trend going on TikTok? I mean, it's really amazing. It's something the GAPP is behind 100%.
Can you touch a little bit more on that? I think that will be an interesting topic for our listeners, because I think, and I want your take on this too, if you can give it, the term imitation crab, right? Is that misleading? Does that do pollock an injustice? Because that's really one of the ingredients. And I know they've been doing some work around that, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on imitation crab.
No, it's horrible, and it's a case study. The late John Connolly with NFI, when I joined the seafood industry, sat me down and gave me a little historical lesson on how we sort of arrived at where we're at. And it's a perfect case study in asking the government for an answer. It can be quite dangerous at times. If you look today at the plant-based meat industry and plant-based milk industries, they didn't go to FDA and say, what should we call this? They went to market with Beyond Burger. They went to market with soy milk and basically said, catch us if you can.
Yeah.
And they got into the market. They got demand for their products. And then FDA was really in a catch-up mode of having to arrive at a mutually agreeable solution. Serene seafood really, especially katakama or imitation crab, built demand in Japan in the 70s and started to come over to the United States in the mid-80s. And it was at that point that we said, well, what are we going to call this product to introduce it into the marketplace? And when we sat down with FDA, they looked at these antiquated laws that they have authorities under and said, well, what are we going to do? And they said, well, it's not crab, and the law says that it's not a real thing. It's not actually that thing. You need to call it imitation of that thing. The problem we've got, and GAPP has spent a lot of money on consumer research. The problem we have is that about a third of consumers will not eat food labeled imitation. They wrongly think imitation food is somehow or other not real. In the case of surimi seafood or imitation crab, it's a real food made from a real fish with an amazing story to tell, which is Alaska Pollock. And that's one of the reasons you'll see some brands out there like Simply Surimi from Transocean and others that are trying to lean in with a surimi seafood name and say, look, consumers maybe don't know what surimi is, but they don't know what imitation crab is either. So I think we're going to have to find ourselves in a place where FDA is a little more collaborative because it's doing real damage to a domestic product and a very healthy product that I think could work really well affordably in getting consumers to eat more seafood. Our research has conclusively shown, and I've spent 40 years, basically my entire career in protein marketing. And one thing that's really unusual to find is a product that the more consumers find out about it, the more they like it. And surimi seafood is that. When we've had focus groups and we've talked to consumers about what imitation crab actually is, they actually like it more than less. And when we give them recipe ideas, they're more likely to buy it and put it in their cart. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to have to do a better job of as an industry is saying, look at the growth we're seeing in the plant-based space. That growth was allowed because you did not disparage them. We need the same, frankly, the same treatment for surimi seafood as well.
This talk of having Alaska Pollock prominently on packaging has just made me think. So wild Alaska Pollock is produced and caught in Alaska and domestically within the United States. Where is the primary consumption for wild Alaska Pollock?
Well, so if you look at the fish, and there's a variety of components that come off of it, any protein, you're going to have different components come off of it. If you're just talking the flesh, about half is going to go into surimi and about half is going to go into filet. Most of the filet, the largest single market is Northern Europe. Northern Europeans eat a lot of whitefish. And as I said, obviously the collapse of the Atlantic cod stocks created a hole that really needed to be filled for that demand. And so Alaska Pollock has really gone that direction. So if you look at the ports out of, Dutch Harbor is where a lot of our product will leave on container ships. Where is that filet going? The number one port for the filet is Rotterdam. And that's going to go into to feed those northern German manufacturing facilities that make fish fingers and things like that are wildly popular in northern Europe. The other component's the surimi. Surimi overwhelmingly finds its home in Asia. And so Asian markets love surimi and everything from shabu shabu, you'll have fish balls in that, to different other surimi products. One thing that's interesting, in the United States, we think of surimi as almost entirely imitation crab. That's only about 3% of the surimi market in Japan. If you go to Japan, surimi seafood takes all different product forms, most of which are not imitation crab or crab analogs. And that's one of the things that I think has a lot of opportunity here in the States. And if you look at some of the brand players like Aquademia, they're really trying to bring a lot of that variety to the surimi seafood product line into the United States as well.
How is the pollock industry adapting to the ongoing concerns of climate change and even consumer preferences, which I think you touched on a little bit already, but could you expand a little bit more on that?
Well, we're, clearly as a wild capture fishery, we're as concerned about climate change as anyone out there. We don't produce our product in a controlled environment.
Mm-hmm.
It's, as we were talking about Tetley sketch a little while ago, this is as wild as a wild capture food can be out in the Bering Sea. And so we're an industry that is very rooted in caring about the environment because we depend on the environment to produce the very food that we harvest and bring to consumers. One of the things I will say is GAPP has invested heavily. We've done the industry's first life cycle assessment documenting carbon footprint back in 2020. We're going to repeat that study next year to show the hopeful improvements that we've made as an industry. But unequivocally, Alaska Pollock has an unbelievably low carbon footprint. So if consumers are truly concerned about climate change and they want to make an impact on that when it comes to their dietary choices, choosing more Alaska Pollock really helps the environment, maybe much more so than other protein options out there. I think that's something that all seafood truly enjoys. And I think that's a message that that I think collectively as an industry, we need to do a better job of, is helping people understand the really important role that seafood can play in the actions that we are all taking, not only individually, but collectively, to address climate change.
I think as consumers, and we think of wild captured species, everyone thinks of bycatch. And I read that the incidental salmon catch within the Pollock fisheries is extremely low, and it's one of the lowest it's been in years. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, it's no coincidence that we were the MSC's largest, first large scale fishery that they certified. We are the largest certified sustainable fishery on the planet. We are very fortunate that Alaska pollock tend to school together very closely, and there's not a lot of other species in those schools. We also, as an industry, have invested very heavily in technologies to ensure that before we drop nets, we know what's down there. Our radar systems tell us conclusively not only what the average size of the fish are, but what the largest size of the fish are. And if there's fish that are 4 foot long, we know those aren't Alaska pollock, and that's not an area that we're going to fish. The fleet communicates with each other. The fleet does a lot of things with test tows and things like that to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that when we pull up those bags, they're as clean as possible. That's one of the things that, as I talked about earlier, when it came to being a rationalized fishery, and there's not sort of a stopwatch going on saying you got to catch that fish quickly or else your competitor will catch it. Instead, when companies go into a season knowing I have a share that I can catch and I can take my time to catch it responsibly, it gives them that ability that if there's a period that the nets are coming up with more incidental catch, they can step down and wait until those potentially salmon or whatever the other fish are that are transiting through those Alaska pollock schools have made their way. But in general, they just don't intermingle. And that's one of the things that really makes our fishery special is there's just no fishery of again, the scale that's going to give you that less than 1% incidental catch. I know when I go fishing and I drop a line, I'm really happy when I get what I want. But it's certainly not 1% of the time that I get something that I wasn't intending to get. And that's in fact what we do. And I think that's one of the things that if you really watch the videos of those bags opening up on the decks of the boats, it is amazing just how purely it's just Alaska pollock that's flowing out. And I think that's one of the things that's really something that I'm proud of. And I think is a story that we've got to do a better job of telling so that everyone sees it as well. Because I think we all know that if you drive across, Kansas or, areas where there's commodity agriculture, the biodiversity there is a fraction of what it was before man. But if you go through the Bering Sea, the biodiversity is still there. And I think we should be really proud of it.
Yeah, I think that really sets Alaska pollock apart because usually when people have criticisms of wild caught fisheries, a bycatch is a huge portion of those issues that people have. So I think that that's a huge part of the story of wild Alaska pollock.
Could you talk a little bit about average catch size? Even though it's a podcast, so it's audio only, but could you paint like that visual for our listeners of what a pollock looks like, what the average size is? Alaska
pollock's a cousin of cod. So the flesh is that bright white. You think of that fillet of fish and you bite in, and that's what the flesh is. It's not a deep red sockeye salmon or anything like that. On the outside, I think it's a very cute fish. It's not a huge fish. Usually you're talking about 18 inches to 2 foot long. It depends each year. We're typically fishing on a different year class. But in general, we're talking about fish. They're going to be somewhere around 600 grams. So that's like 1.5 pounds. So we kind of call it little fish, big fish. We are big by our scale. It isn't that we're catching individually large fish. And so those fillets that we catch, they work really well, from the portion control perspective and things like that. But these aren't massive animals that we're pulling out of the sea. They're large by their numbers, not individual.
One point that you brought up earlier is the relation to indigenous communities, specifically in Alaska. And I think that that's something that would be really interesting to delve a little bit more into. So pollock is a cornerstone species for many fishing communities and specifically in Alaska. So can you share how its production supports local economies, especially in rural areas?
Yeah, this is really an amazing story. When the American Fisheries Act was passed, Alaska was very fortunate to have a very powerful senator in Senator Stevens. And at the time, Alaska pollock, it's the national fish of Korea. Alaska pollock for millennia has had an important role either in dried form or preparations of the roe or things like that in Korean and Japanese cuisines. And most of the fishing that was being conducted in the Bering Sea with these Asian trawlers that were coming to catch the fish. And in many cases, actually what we were calling roe stripping, which was catching the fish for that very valuable roe, opening the bellies up, taking the roe, and just throwing the fish overboard. I mean, very unsustainable practices. And when the American Fisheries Act came through, what happened was they brought everyone together and said, we're going to Americanize this fishery, and we're going to make sure that it supports not only America, but it's going to support Alaska too. It's their resource. And so under the American Fisheries Act, what they did is these 65 indigenous communities that border the resource, they put them under these 6 different community development core groups. And those CDQs in perpetuity own 10% of that catch. And they lease that catch back to companies that were allowed to enter into the fishery after the AFA passed. And so after the American Fisheries Act passed, the foreign ownership had to step back to U.S. ownership. So you saw the rise of these current companies today that own the onshore plants and the at-sea processors and the catch vessel cooperatives that harvest it. And they would lease from these indigenous communities the rights to catch their fish on their behalf. What they've done with that money over time is buy into those very companies. And so that 10% is now grown to over 30%. And so many of my member companies now are partly or entirely owned by these communities in Alaska, bringing back real dollars into those areas for infrastructure and other things that they choose to do for their own communities. And so all those subsistence fishings and things like that have a very important cultural tie and things that we are obviously very, very concerned about. And people also need economic development. And that's one of the things the Alaska pollock fishery provides, because as we're selling Alaska pollock, in a grocery store in Berlin, we're selling Alaska pollock at a shabu-shabu restaurant in downtown Tokyo. A portion of those proceeds are going directly back into those communities. And I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful story.
Have you seen the demand for pollock in the United States grow over time through your marketing efforts?
Unequivocally. So we've had 2 factors going on. Obviously, our fishery is very impacted by the events in Ukraine. Alaska pollock or Pacific pollock, the species, about 60% of the global catch is on the Russian side, about 40% is on the U.S. side. And so the 2 countries really service this global market. Mm-hmm. When I started here at Alaska pollock, a very substantial portion of the U.S. market was controlled by the Russian fisheries. Under federal law, to call it Alaska pollock in the United States, it has to be caught in only U.S. waters in Alaska. And so you would often see, if you flipped over those bags of fish sticks, or if you would have seen the ingredient statement at a restaurant in the food service sector, the ingredient statement on their pollock, it would have been Russian product. What's happened as we've worked to build demand for wild Alaska pollock, we've seen more and more brands choose to source from U.S. caught Pacific pollock so that they can market it as wild Alaska pollock. And so if you look around, you're seeing more and more of that happening. It was happening organically in the market, mainly because consumers, when told that this is a product that comes from the United States, they have a preference for that. Domestic seafood often does carry a preference by consumers. We were building that organically, getting that number up over 70% of the pollock on the U.S. market being caught in Alaska. But then with Ukraine, the Biden administration passed an executive order that banned not only direct from Russia shipments of pollock, but even pollock that has been reprocessed in third countries like China. Mm-hmm. And so currently, we own the entire U.S. market. And so we're very focused at GAPP on making sure that we're supporting our partners out there that maybe even previously were sourcing Russian caught fish, to make sure that now that they're sourcing U.S. caught fish that sells at a premium, not only in the U.S. market, but at the global market. We're supporting them and making sure that if and when, hopefully the events in Ukraine are over, and if and when Russia can join the community of responsible nations and export its fish around the world, Alaska pollock from Alaska still has an advantage for retailers and food service operations that are currently having to use it if they're only sourced but when they have a choice, still choose to use it.
So I have a few more questions that I want to ask, but before I get into those, is there anything else that you want to get out there about pollock as a species? Anything while you have this platform?
I think the biggest thing that my members would want me to say is that GAPP is here to support our partners. Alaska pollock is a very unique fish. It's not a fish that you walk into the grocery store and you see that beautiful seafood department beacon that you walk over and you look in the seafood case and typically will find fillets of Alaska pollock. That's not where we're at. We're that grist that goes into the global whitefish market, the global streaming market, and we're more often than not an ingredient in a branded product. And that's really where GAPP was born. We work very closely with our brothers and sisters at the Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute. And ASME does an amazing job of building a halo around Alaska seafood and driving demand for that ASME logo. Problem is, our fish just isn't in that seafood case with the sockeye salmon, with the king crab, with the Alaska halibut. We're in the frozen food aisle in that Gordon's fish stick. We're in the smoked fish case in that Transocean Crab Classic. We're in that California roll in the deli case. We're in other parts of the store. And so for us to get to the consumer or get the consumer to be aware of our fish and have demand for our fish, we have to be a very responsible partner. And the way we do that is through consumer research that helps brands better market products that contain our fish, but even more importantly, our partnership program. We have dollars out there. So if there are brands that are considering a fish to choose to use in their brand, our partnership dollars are not about promoting GAPP. They're not even really about promoting everything about the fishery. They're very much about promoting that brand because we want our brand to be successful because they're the ones that are really selling our product to the consumer. So we just want to make sure that we've always got that open hand out there globally for any company out there that would like resources to market their products. GAPP is here for them.
So if any of our listeners want to learn more about GAPP, what is the best way that they can do that?
We spend a lot of effort, obviously, on our website, alaskapollock.org. We have a very active social media on virtually every platform at Wild AK Pollock. Obviously, contact me, craig.morris at alaskapollock.org. We are here to help. Our industry has put resources together for us to do some great things. It's a partnership, and we need people to just pick up the phone and call and say, I've got a crazy idea, because we're here to listen.
Great.
And I'll make sure. Oh, sorry, Maddie, you were going to say it, but we'll make sure everything you just mentioned we will put in our show notes, so it'll be really easily accessible by all of our listeners.
So before we close up, I'm curious what your perspective is on what the future is for Alaska pollock. Like, where do you see things going in the next 2 to 5 years for the species?
It's really evolved. I think pre-COVID, we were very focused on upscale. That I think the consumer pre-COVID really looked at celebrity chefs and what was going on at white tablecloth restaurants, the scene. We were very focused on how do we make Alaska pollock cool through its association with that very high-end culinary experience. I think today we have a very different focus. I think consumers are very different today. I think COVID and a variety of things really drove home concerns about sustainability. I think COVID and a variety of other things have really driven home concerns about health and nutrition. Our marketing is much more today centered on how this is an amazing fish for young families. They want to get their children on a healthy, lifelong journey of eating seafood. Alaska pollock is a very approachable fish because of its mild taste. It can work really well to put them on that lifelong journey. In general, our consumer research has shown that more educated, more affluent families are more likely to care about these issues. And so our marketing is really pivoted towards talking about really complicated things like carbon footprint, because there are some people out there that are more affluent, that are more educated, that are really seeking that out in the marketplace. And so I think that's really been our shift. We spent a lot of resources at GAPP 5-6 years ago on those celebrity influencers. And I think today, if you look at the influencers that we're partnering with the most, It's those that are really trying to tell you where your food comes from. And that's really been a big shift for us.
Excellent, Craig. This was a really great and informative conversation. And I hope we didn't catch you off guard with too many of our offshoot questions, but there was just so many things that I didn't
like
know.
Those better.
I feel like there's a lot of our listeners that are probably have the same baseline as myself, so I felt obligated to ask certain questions. But this was, again, a great conversation, and we were really thrilled to have you on and be able to share all of your insights about Pollock. So thank you very much again for joining us.
My pleasure.
Folks, that was our conversation with Craig Morris. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Make sure to follow Aquademia on X at Aquademia Pod. If you want to contact the podcast for any reason, you can do so with our online form, which is located at globalseafood.org/podcast.
And if you enjoyed this episode, then be sure to subscribe to Aquademia on your podcast platform of choice.
Ciao.
Bye.